I'm recording this log not to be excused, but to warn you. If a rescue team finds this, if you're listening to my voice crackling over a dead channel, turn back. Do not descend to the lower levels of Borealis Station. Do not try to be heroes. Life is not something you'll find down there anymore. Our base is a steel pimple on the face of Antarctica, a monument to human arrogance pressed into a continent that has never known warmth. There are 2 miles of glacial ice beneath our feet, a solid, unthinking mass that holds the planet's oldest secrets. Above us, an endless polar storm rages, a convenient and impenetrable veil for the true purpose of our geological mission. Officially, we're drilling for ancient air pockets, trapping million-year-old atmosphere in titanium cores. That's the story for the press releases and the congressional funding committees. The truth is, we're jailers. Our primary function is to guard 2 matte-black containers, each the size of a coffin, hauled up from the subglacial Lake Vostok a month ago. They sit in the deepest, coldest part of the station, Section 0, and no one is supposed to know they exist. The atmosphere inside Borealis was always tense, a low-grade hum of paranoia and professional jealousy. There was a clear divide. The science team, led by the perpetually ill Dr. Voss, treated us technicians like glorified janitors, necessary parts of the machine, but ultimately replaceable. We kept the lights on, the heat flowing, and the air breathable. They, in turn, were decoding God, or so they thought. We saw them as eggheads playing with forces they didn't comprehend. They saw us as grunts with wrenches, incapable of understanding the gravity of their work. The friction was a constant, like the low vibration of the geothermal generator that ran through the station's deck plates. Then the weather turned. The forecast had called for a Class 2 storm, manageable. What we got was something else entirely. It was as if the continent itself was trying to scrape us off its back. The external pressure sensors went haywire, their digital readouts flickering between impossible numbers. The anemometers on the surface mast screamed, logging wind gusts that theoretically could bend the station's main structural I-beams. The walls of the living module began to thrum, a deep, resonant vibration that traveled up from the ice, through the foundation pylons, and into the fillings in your teeth. It felt less like being in a building and more like being inside the chest cavity of some vast, shuddering beast. Major Brandt, the station's commander and a man whose spine was forged from military regulations, finally made the call. His voice, usually a calm baritone, was tight and clipped over the intercom. "All personnel, this is a code orange. I repeat, code orange. Seal all exterior airlocks. Engineering, confirm integrity of the laboratory sector seals. Now." Amid the controlled chaos of alarms and slamming hatches, I saw Dr. Voss. He looked worse than usual, which was saying something. His skin, normally pale, had taken on a waxy gray sheen. The veins on his neck and the backs of his hands stood out like black threads under parchment. He was clutching his side where the portable hemodialysis unit he was never without was clipped to his belt. The machine, a marvel of miniaturization, filtered his blood of some unnamed congenital toxin. Without it, he'd be dead in hours. He kept glancing at its monitor, his fingers twitching, a cornered animal checking the bars of its cage. That's when the impact hit. It wasn't a gust of wind. It was a solid, deafening blow that felt like the fist of a titan striking the ice shelf miles away. The entire station lurched sideways. Furniture slid, monitors crashed to the floor, and for 3 terrifying seconds, the main power grid failed, plunging us into absolute darkness. The backup generators kicked in, flooding the corridors with the sickening red glow of emergency lighting. But another sound had joined the howling of the wind and the groan of straining metal. A high, piercing siren. It was the hull breach alarm. A quick glance at my console confirmed my worst fear. The alert was coming from Section 0. The glacier had shifted. Down in the dark, where we kept our secrets, the integrity of the station was compromised. The emergency lights bathed everything in a nauseating crimson, turning the familiar corridors of Borealis into the arteries of a dying animal. Faces I saw every day were now distorted masks of alarm, eyes wide and mouths agape in the hellish glow. My training took over, pushing the fear down into a tight knot in my gut. I ran, my boots pounding on the metal deck plates, heading for the engineering server room. My job was to assess the damage, to keep this place from tearing itself apart. The main console was a Christmas tree of warning lights. Life support systems were straining, recycling air at maximum capacity, but the geothermal generator feed showed a critical error, a power fluctuation that threatened a total shutdown. In the ensuing scramble, no one saw Dr. Voss slip away. I caught a glimpse of him on a security feed as I rerouted power relays, a stooped, unsteady figure lurching towards the medical bay, one hand pressed hard against his chest as if trying to hold himself together. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. The chaos was his cover. Then, a new cascade of alerts lit up my board. A total power failure in the medical wing. It was isolated, a breaker trip from the main jolt, but for Voss it was a death sentence. His personal dialysis machine, the delicate apparatus filtering the poison from his blood, went silent. Its soft, rhythmic pump ceased. The green light on its display winked out. The security cameras in his private lab, running on a separate battery backup, showed the rest. I watched, helpless, on a small monitor. He fumbled with the emergency power outlet, his hands shaking too violently to connect the plug. He was gasping, his face contorted in a silent scream of agony as the unfiltered toxins flooded his system. In his desperation, he tried to manually override the machine's pump, jamming a pen into a reset port. But instead of initiating a gentle cleaning cycle, he triggered a catastrophic failure. The system, designed to push cleansing fluid through the filter, did the opposite. With a sudden, pressurized hiss, the machine backflushed. The entire reservoir of concentrated, filtered-out pathogen, the very essence of his disease, which he called Virus 5, was injected directly back into his bloodstream. What happened next is burned into my memory. His body arched off the floor in a rigid bow, a convulsion of such violence I could almost hear his spine snap. His joints twisted at impossible angles. The skin on his face pulled taut against his skull, his lips retracting into a ghastly grin. His scream was lost behind the soundproof glass of the lab, but I saw it. I saw the raw, undiluted agony in his eyes, and then I saw it change. The pain vanished, replaced by an expression of cold, crystalline clarity. It was something glacial, ancient, and utterly alien. He collapsed back onto the floor, then rose. There was no struggle. He moved with a fluid, horrifying grace, like a dancer or a predator. The sickness, the frailty, it was all gone. He stood straight, his head tilted slightly as if listening to a sound no one else could hear. He turned and looked directly into the lens of the security camera. It wasn't a glance. It was a stare of appraisal. He saw me. I know he saw me, sitting miles away on the other side of the station, a ghost in his machine. Then, with a calm, deliberate motion, he drew back his fist and punched the reinforced steel panel that controlled the lab's magnetic lock. The metal buckled, sparks flew, and the door slid open. He stepped out, a pale figure swallowed by the unlit corridors of the technical level, and was gone. Major Brandt was a man built of protocol and procedure. While I was fighting to keep the station's heart beating, he was descending into its gut. Ignoring my frantic warnings over the comms about structural instability and fluctuating power, he was heading down to Section 0 to personally assess the hull breach. "Eyes on the problem, Gorski," he'd barked, his voice tight with authority. "That's how we solve it." He was a soldier, and this was his battlefield. Down in the lowest level, the cold was a physical presence. It was a deep, biting cold that normal thermal gear couldn't touch. Brandt's breath plumed in front of his face, freezing into crystalline clouds the instant it left his lips. The beam of his high-powered flashlight cut a nervous path through the absolute darkness, illuminating a scene of wreckage. Massive support girders were twisted like pretzels. The walls were coated in a thick, feathery layer of frost. The impact had done more damage than the sensors indicated. He found the source of the breach, a jagged 10-foot fissure in the outer hull, right next to the sample vault. One of the two black cylinders, the one marked with a stenciled L, had been crushed by a falling section of the ceiling. Its containment shell was cracked open like an egg. The air around it was thick with a shimmering golden haze. At first, Brandt must have thought it was dust kicked up by the impact. But as the particles swirled in his flashlight beam, he would have realized his mistake. They weren't dust. They were spores. Microscopic, cryopreserved, and now, thanks to the draft from the breach, airborne. Panic must have clawed at his throat. He reached for the helmet of his emergency suit, fumbling with the seals. But it was too late. The biosensors embedded in the collar of his uniform were already flashing red. A tiny, insistent chirp confirmed it. Biological hazard detected. Massive inhalation event. Contamination was not a possibility. It was a fact. Brandt knew the regulations. He had drilled them into us. In a scenario like this, a Class A biohazard exposure, the protocol was brutally simple. Terminate the infected subject immediately to prevent spread. He was supposed to draw his sidearm and end it right there. Or failing that, call for me to vent the entire section into the Antarctic void, sacrificing him to save the rest. But duty is a concept forged in briefing rooms and training simulations. Instinct is a far older, far more powerful force. The instinct to survive, to breathe, to fight, took over. "Brandt to command," he said into his radio, his voice shockingly steady. "Hull breach confirmed. The container is damaged, but the inner seal is holding. No sign of leakage. I'm securing the area." It was a clean, catastrophic lie. With that, he sealed his own fate and ours. He made his way to the Section 0 armory, a small, reinforced room where the emergency munitions were stored. We heard the heavy thud and scrape of the magnetic lock being manually overridden, followed by the definitive sound of a heavy steel crossbar sliding into place. He was locking himself in. A few minutes later, his breathing came over the open channel. It started as a ragged cough, then deepened into something wet and guttural. We heard a tearing sound, not metal this time, but fabric. His muscles, supercharged by the mutagen, were starting to spasm and swell, ripping through the synthetic fibers of his thermal undersuit. His voice came again, but it wasn't Brandt anymore. It was a fractured, growling whisper, full of words that made no sense. He spoke of the pack, of a gnawing hunger, of the scent of heat. Then, the transmission dissolved into a raw, bestial snarl, and the line went dead. From the armory, deep below us, came a new sound. The rhythmic, terrible shriek of metal being clawed, bent, and reshaped. He wasn't hiding. He was nesting. We gathered in the mess hall, the 4 of us who were left in the topside section. It felt like the last lifeboat on a sinking ship. There was me. Kovich, the station's biologist, a man whose scientific curiosity was rapidly being eroded by sheer terror. Harrow, the communications tech, her face pale as she stared at a board of dead channels. And Tully, a fellow mechanic whose usual good humor had evaporated, leaving behind a nervous, twitching energy. The absence of our 2 commanding officers was a suffocating presence in the room. Brandt and Voss were gone, and with them, any semblance of order. A new sound had joined the symphony of the storm. The ventilation system, usually a steady low hum, had started to pulse with a strange, resonant thrum. It wasn't the sound of fans or motors. It sounded deeper, organic, like a slow, heavy wind moving through the station's metal lungs. It made the hair on my arms stand up. "I'm trying them again," I said, more to break the silence than with any real hope. I keyed the internal comms. "Major Brandt, please respond." "Dr. Voss, do you copy?" The speakers answered with a hiss of empty static. They were either dead or they didn't want to be found. Kovich, ever the scientist, couldn't sit still. "I'm checking the med bay," he announced, his voice tight. If Voss had a medical episode, that's where he'd be. Maybe he just passed out. I didn't believe it for a second, but I couldn't let him go alone. I grabbed the heaviest tool I could find, a 2-foot-long pipe wrench that felt solid and reassuring in my grip, and followed him. The medbay was unnervingly pristine. No sign of a struggle, no overturned equipment. It was sterile, quiet, and that was far more frightening than chaos. It was as if someone had meticulously cleaned a crime scene. Every instrument was in its place, scalpels and clamps laid out in neat descending order of size. An obsession with order had been here. We found Voss's personal research terminal. His journal was open on the screen, but the last few entries, dated just after the power surge, weren't in English. They were a dense, complex cryptographic cipher, strings of alphanumeric code that flowed in patterns too intricate to be random. Kovich stared at it, his face ashen. "No human could compose this," he whispered. "Not this quickly. The processing power required. It's beyond us." As we stood there, the lights in the corridor outside flickered erratically. It wasn't the storm. The fluctuations were deliberate, rhythmic. Someone was inside the station's power grid, redirecting energy flows, isolating circuits. They were cutting the station up into pieces, turning our home into a maze. Suddenly, Tully's voice, raw with panic, screamed over our handheld radios.
"Oh God. Gorski, get to the server room, now!"
We ran. We found him standing over the body of a junior lab technician named Peterson. He was slumped against a server rack, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing. But there was no blood. Not a drop. His skin was gray and desiccated, his limbs strangely shrunken. He looked like a mummy, every ounce of fluid drawn out of him. Kovich knelt, his hands shaking as he pointed to the man's neck. There were no bite marks, no savage wounds. Just 2 small, precise puncture marks on his carotid artery, as clean and deliberate as if made by a surgeon's needle. Before we could process the horror, a voice echoed from the PA speakers in the ceiling. It was smooth, calm, and resonant, a voice you'd trust to sell you a luxury car. It was Voss's voice, but stripped of all its previous weakness and filled with a chilling, velvety confidence. "My apologies for the mess," he said, his tone conversational. "A necessary resource acquisition. For those of you remaining, I invite you to join me in the main control room. It is time we discussed the optimization of station personnel. We didn't accept Voss's invitation. We barricaded ourselves in the command center, the station's nerve center, shoving heavy equipment against the main door. It was a futile gesture, and we knew it. If Voss controlled the systems, he controlled the locks. We were rats who had just locked ourselves in the trap. The room was a semicircle of consoles facing a large viewport that looked out into the eternal white fury of the storm. It felt like the edge of the world. The attack didn't come from the door. It came from the ceiling. In the far corner of the room, a heavy steel ventilation grate, bolted into the framework, suddenly blew inwards with explosive force. It shot across the room like a cannonball and embedded itself in the opposite wall with a deafening clang. From the dark, square hole it left behind, something unfolded. It was Brandt, or what was left of him. The thing that dropped to the floor was a hulking mass of corded muscle and jutting off-white bone spurs that had pierced through its skin. Its body was grotesquely elongated, its limbs too long for its torso, granting it a horrifying arachnoid posture. It was blind, its eyes covered by a milky cataract-like film, but its head swiveled back and forth, broad nostrils flaring as it tasted the air. It was hunting by scent, by heat, by the frantic drumming of our hearts. Harrow broke. The sight was too much for her mind to process. With a choked scream, she fumbled for the flare gun from the emergency kit on the wall. She fired it blindly. The magnesium flare erupted with a blinding white light and a furious hiss, momentarily illuminating the creature in stark, terrifying detail. The light and sound didn't scare it. They enraged it. It let out a chuffing, guttural roar and moved with a speed that defied its bulk. It didn't charge across the floor. In a single, powerful leap, it sprang towards the ceiling. Long, claw-like talons erupted from its fingertips, and it slammed into the metal panels overhead, sinking its claws in with a sound like nails being driven through steel. It clung there upside down, a predator that had rewritten the rules of gravity. Virus L, I realized with a jolt of horror, had made him the perfect ambush hunter for this environment. It dropped from above, aiming for Harrow. I reacted on pure instinct. My hand slammed down on the emergency fire suppression button on the main console. Vents in the ceiling hissed open, instantly flooding the room with dense clouds of CO2 gas. The room became a maelstrom of suffocating white fog, visibility dropping to zero. The cold gas was a shock to the system, but it masked our heat signatures and choked the air, hopefully confusing the creature's enhanced sense of smell. "This way," I yelled, grabbing Kovich by the arm. We scrambled out the secondary maintenance hatch, plunging into the narrow, claustrophobic crawl space between the command center and the outer hull. Behind us, we could hear the monster's enraged snarls and the heavy, rhythmic thud of it dropping to the floor. We ran, stumbling through the dark, cramped tunnels, the sound of its heavy breathing and the scrape of its talons on the grated floor echoing right behind us. Tully was just ahead of me. He tripped on a thick power conduit, his feet going out from under him. He hit the deck with a grunt. I turned to help him, my hand outstretched, but it was too late. There was a blur of motion in the dark, a short, wet impact, and then silence. When I looked back, Tully was gone. The creature didn't just kill. It was taking its prey, dragging the bodies back into the ventilation shafts, back into the dark arteries of the station it now called its hunting grounds. 3 of us left: me, Kovich, and Harrow. We found refuge in the station's hydroponics bay, a humid green oasis in the middle of the frozen hellscape. The constant gurgle of the water pumps, and the thick, earthy smell of soil and growing plants provided a sensory camouflage we desperately needed. We huddled behind a row of nutrient tanks, trying to quiet our ragged breathing, listening for any sound beyond the artificial life of the garden. The terrible truth of our situation began to crystallize in the humid air. This wasn't a simple monster hunt. We were caught between two distinct, horrifying apex predators. Voss was the spider at the center of the web, his intellect fused with the station's systems, watching, calculating, manipulating. Brant was his beast, a mindless engine of destruction let loose in the corridors, a creature of pure savage instinct. One was the brain, the other was the muscle. As if summoned by our thoughts, the brilliant grow lights of the hydroponics bay shut off, plunging us into darkness. A moment later, they were replaced by a low, eerie purple glow from the supplemental UV lamps. The familiar green plants were transformed into alien shapes, their leaves a ghostly pale blue. On a maintenance terminal screen across the room, text began to appear, typed by an unseen hand. A simple equation, gentlemen. And lady, the creature that was once Major Brant is an inefficient, chaotic variable. It consumes resources indiscriminately. Its behavior is untidy. The text paused, as if for dramatic effect. Deliver it to me. Lead it to the generator room. In exchange, I will grant one of you passage to the surface hangar. The other two will be considered acceptable losses. You have 10 minutes to choose your sacrificial lamb. It was a classic psychological attack. A prisoner's dilemma designed to shatter our fragile alliance, to make us look at each other not as comrades but as rivals for a single lottery ticket out of hell. My eyes met Kovic's in the purple gloom. Who would we sacrifice? Who would be the one to trust a monster's promise? Kovic, his scientific mind kicking back into gear, noticed something else. Gorski, the irrigation misters, he whispered, pointing. They're not spraying water. Look at the pressure gauge on that line. It's connected to the anesthetic gas reserve from the med bay, a trap within a trap. While we debated his twisted offer, Voss was preparing to simply put us to sleep and collect us all. We moved quickly, using a crowbar from a toolkit to smash the main valve and the delicate sprayer nozzles before the gas could be released. Voss's response was immediate and petulant. The station's internal doors began to open and close randomly, the heavy thud of magnetic locks echoing through the halls. He was hurting us, cutting off escape routes, trying to flush us out of hiding like rats in a maze. Through the reinforced glass of the hydroponics bay door, we saw him. He walked down the corridor, not with the shambling gait I remembered, but with a liquid, predatory elegance. His skin was the color of bleached bone, and his eyes were voids, two pits of absolute black. He was beautiful and terrifying. He passed a service junction where, moments before, we'd heard Brant's enraged snarls. He didn't engage. He didn't even slow down. He was using the cameras to observe his creation, studying its movements, its weaknesses. He wasn't just a monster. He was a scientist conducting the ultimate field experiment. Harrow, staring at a schematic on the terminal, found our only path. "The hangar?" she said, her voice trembling. "The only route that avoids the main corridors goes through the geothermal generator room, the very place Voss wanted us to go." The spider was inviting us into his parlor. There was only one way to reach the generator room without being seen: through the sub-level waste recycling tunnels. It was a route not shown on most schematics, a maze of pipes and conduits that handled the station's refuse. It was our only hope of staying off Voss's all-seeing camera network. The stench in the tunnels was overwhelming. a cloying mix of chemicals, decay, and freezing slush that clung to the inside of your throat. The cold was a damp, penetrating chill that seeped through our layers of clothing, but it was a place of shadows, hidden from the spider in his web. We moved slowly, our flashlights cutting feeble beams through the oppressive dark. That's where we stumbled upon it. Voss's new laboratory. He had dragged a portable operating table and several racks of medical equipment into a wider section of the tunnel. On the table, strapped down with power cables, was one of the other engineers, a guy named Davies. He was still alive. His eyes were wide with a terror so profound it had gone beyond screaming. Voss was standing over him, not with a weapon of rage, but with the precise tools of a surgeon. He was performing a vivisection, dissecting Davies while he was still conscious, tracing nerve clusters and muscle fibers with a gleaming scalpel. Digital readouts from probes attached to Davies's body fed information to a nearby monitor. Voss wasn't killing him for sustenance. He was studying him, harvesting biological data, looking for ways to improve his own viral strain using the unique DNA of his former colleagues. The sight broke something in me. It was a violation so complete, so coldly intellectual that it was worse than any bestial rampage. Kovich made a strangled sound, a mix of a sob and a gasp. I lunged forward, clapping a hand over his mouth and dragging him back behind a large cluster of frozen pipes before Voss could see us. But he knew. He must have heard the scuff of a boot or the subtle shift in air pressure. He paused his work, his head lifting and turning slowly in our direction. We were completely hidden, shrouded in darkness and steam, but he looked right at our position. His black eyes seemed to pierce the shadows. Alex Gorski, his voice echoed in the enclosed space, calm and conversational, not needing a PA system. Heart rate, 130 beats per minute. Adrenaline levels spiking. A classic fight or flight response. And Dr. Kovich. Such a fascinating arrhythmia you have. A weakness we may need to correct. He was reading us like a medical chart, dissecting us from afar. My mind raced. We needed a diversion. I pulled out my service tablet, my fingers fumbling on the touch screen. I accessed the sub-levels maintenance controls, found the schematic for the water purification pumps at the far end of the corridor, and deliberately pushed the pressure regulator into the red line. The explosion wasn't huge, but in the confined tunnel, it was deafening. A massive cast iron pipe burst, spewing a high-pressure jet of superheated steam and water across the corridor. For a few precious seconds, the entire area was an impenetrable cloud of white vapor. Voss vanished into the mist. We didn't wait to see where he went. We knew he could move faster than our eyes could track. We scrambled for the main service elevator shaft 50 yards away. It was our only way up to the generator level. We reached the heavy steel doors and pried them open, only to stare into a black vertical abyss. The elevator car was locked at the top of the shaft, hundreds of feet above. The only way up was to climb the greasy, ice-slick emergency ladder and the thick steel cables that ran alongside it. The elevator shaft was a vertical tomb. Every sound echoed unnaturally. Our ragged breaths, the groan of the thick steel cables under our weight, the drip of condensation falling into the blackness below. The emergency ladder was slick with a film of machine oil and freezing moisture, forcing us to rely on the main lift cables, our gloved hands screaming with the effort of holding on. We were exposed, vulnerable, climbing out of one layer of hell into another. Then, from the bottom of the shaft, from the deep, impenetrable dark, came a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was the low, chuffing growl we'd heard in the vents, the sound of the beast that was once Brant. The explosion must have drawn its attention. It had found our scent. A moment later, it began to climb. It wasn't using the ladder. It was bounding up the shaft, ricocheting from wall to wall, its claws gouging deep furrows in the concrete and steel. It moved with an unnatural, terrifying agility. A predator perfectly adapted to this vertical hunting ground. Loose bolts and chunks of ice rained down on us as it ascended. Kovich, his strength failing, lost his grip. He cried out, his body plummeting into the dark. My heart stopped, but his safety harness, a line we'd clipped to the main cable, caught him with a brutal jerk. He dangled there, 10 feet below me, a helpless pendulum. The beast was almost on him. Its massive, eyeless head lunged up from the shadows, jaws snapping shut inches from his kicking feet. In that moment of pure panic, an idea sparked. A desperate, insane gamble. We couldn't outrun both of them. We couldn't fight either of them. But maybe we didn't have to. Maybe we could make them fight each other. With one hand clinging to the cable, I fumbled for my service tablet. My fingers were numb with cold, but I managed to navigate to the station's audio archives. I found what I was looking for. A medical diagnostic file from Voss's last physical. It included a high-fidelity recording of his heartbeat, taken before his transformation. It was faint, but it was there. I bypassed the tablet's tiny speaker, hacked into the elevator shaft's maintenance intercom system, and broadcast the sound at maximum volume. Thump-thump, thump-thump, thump-thump. The sound of a human heart, Voss's heart, filled the shaft. Down below, the beast froze mid-lunge, its head cocked, its entire body going rigid. The sound confused its primal senses. It was hunting us by our scent, our heat, our own frantic heartbeats. But this new sound was stronger, clearer, a powerful beacon in the darkness. To its feral mind, it must have been the signal of a rival alpha, a greater threat invading its territory. With a roar that shook the entire shaft, Brant changed his target. He ignored the dangling, terrified Kovich. He ignored Harrow and me clinging to the cables above. His new purpose was singular, absolute. He began to scramble upwards again, but this time with a renewed, furious speed, driving towards the source of the sound, towards the top of the shaft, towards the man whose heartbeat echoed in the steel tomb. We scrambled the last 20 feet, heaving ourselves through the open doors onto the generator level's maintenance landing. We collapsed onto the grated floor, gasping for air, our muscles screaming in protest. A moment later, the heavy steel doors to the main generator room slid open with a soft hiss, bathing the landing in the low, red glow of the emergency lights within. It was an invitation. Voss was waiting for his guests. The generator room was a cavernous chamber, a cathedral of industry. 3 massive geothermal turbines, each the size of a locomotive, dominated the space, their silent forms throwing long, dancing shadows in the pulsing red emergency light. Catwalks and gantries crisscrossed the upper levels, creating a complex, 3-dimensional maze of steel. And there, standing on the central control bridge overlooking the entire room, was Voss. He was immaculate. In the midst of the chaos and filth, his white lab coat was spotless. He held a surgical scalpel in one hand, balanced delicately between his fingers like a conductor's baton. He looked down on us, not with anger, but with a kind of detached academic curiosity. "A clever gambit, Alex," he said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "Using the creature's primal instincts against itself. A statistically improbable yet ultimately futile maneuver." He smirked, a subtle cold twisting of his lips. "You've only succeeded in bringing the experiment to its primary subject." I didn't answer him. I raised my tablet and reactivated the intercom, switching the audio feed from Voss's heartbeat to the live microphone on my device. Into it, I channeled the furious guttural roars of Brandt as he clawed his way out of the elevator shaft behind us. I amplified the sound, blasting it through the massive speakers of the generator room. For the first time, Voss's perfect composure cracked. A flicker of genuine annoyance crossed his features. His elegant calculations, his perfectly controlled experiment, had not accounted for the sheer brute force intrusion of the beast. The main blast door at the far end of the room began to buckle inwards, the thick plate steel groaning under a series of titanic impacts. Boom, boom, boom. With a final, ear-splitting shriek of tearing metal, the door ripped from its hinges and flew into the room. Brandt stood silhouetted in the doorway, a hulking nightmare of muscle and bone, drawn by the scent of his creator and the challenge in the air. Harrow and I scrambled for cover, diving behind the thick armored casing of the nearest turbine. From our hiding place, we watched the two apex predators of Borealis Station finally meet. It was a battle of opposing philosophies. Brandt was all rage and mass, a charging behemoth of claws and fury. Voss was speed and precision. He moved like a phantom, sidestepping the beast's clumsy charges with impossible grace, his scalpel flashing in the red light as he darted in and out, making small, precise cuts at the creature's tendons and joints. The beast roared in frustration and pain. Black, steaming ichor, not blood, dripped from its wounds, sizzling as it hit the metal floor. The acidic liquid ate away at the deck plates, forcing Voss to keep moving, to leap up onto the gantries and catwalks, turning the fight into a vertical ballet of death. The clash of bodies, the shriek of claws on steel, the raw, inhuman screams. It was a vision of hell. The fighting was careless, brutal. Brandt, in a blind fury, slammed Voss against the main power distribution panel. Sparks erupted in a blinding shower. Alarms, louder and more urgent than any before, began to blare. A synthesized voice, devoid of emotion, echoed through the chamber. Warning. Reactor coolant systems compromised. Core temperature critical. Meltdown in 10 minutes. The station itself was dying. The entire structure shuddered as the turbines began to spin erratically, their emergency brakes failing. Pipes burst overhead, spewing clouds of hot steam that filled the vast chamber like a dense fog, turning the combatants into monstrous silhouettes moving through the mist. The roar of the dying reactor was a physical force, a deafening wave of sound that drowned out everything else. Through a momentary clearing in the steam, I saw Voss. He was cornered on a high catwalk, his pristine coat now torn and stained with his own black blood. But he was still the strategist. Using his inhuman speed, he triggered a maintenance crane, sending a multi-ton engine block swinging down towards the beast. Brandt, however, was pure instinct. He met the massive object head-on, catching it and hurling it aside with a surge of impossible strength. Wounded but unstoppable, he leaped, clearing 20 feet of open space and tackling Voss on the narrow walkway. They tumbled off the edge, a thrashing, tangled knot of claws, teeth, and cold intellect, falling into the shadows and steam near the base of the main turbine. That was our chance. While the Titans were locked in their death struggle, the path to the surface hangar was clear. "Now!" I yelled to Harrow, pulling her to her feet. We ran, our lungs burning, our legs screaming in protest. We were almost to the hangar airlock when Harrow cried out and collapsed. A piece of shrapnel, sent flying from an exploding conduit, had buried itself deep in her thigh. I didn't hesitate. I hoisted her up, throwing her arm over my shoulder and half carrying, half dragging her, the weight costing us precious seconds. Behind us, a new sound cut through the cacophony, a high-pitched, triumphant shriek of agony and victory. One of them had won. I didn't look back to see which. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. We stumbled through the hangar's inner airlock door. I slammed my palm on the emergency seal button. With a groan of hydraulics, the massive, meter-thick blast door slid shut, cutting us off from the pandemonium in the generator room. Silence, blessed and terrifying, fell around us. The hangar housed a single heavy-duty snowcat, our only way out. I threw Harrow into the passenger seat and jumped behind the controls. The engine turned over with a deep, reassuring roar. The massive hangar doors, responding to my command, began to grind open, revealing a wall of pure, disorienting white. The storm was still raging. As we drove out onto the ice, into the blinding blizzard, I chanced a look in the side view mirror. The view was a surreal nightmare. Borealis Station was convulsing, its interior lights flickering in a final death throe before a blossom of silent internal fire erupted from its core. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Framed in the open airlock of the hangar we had just fled, a figure stood watching us leave. It was tall, slender, and silhouetted against the inferno behind it. I couldn't tell if it was the elegant predator or the hulking beast, remade in the reactor's fire. I didn't know which monster had survived. Stamping down on the accelerator, I drove us into the endless whiteout, into a zero horizon, with a terrible, gnawing question burning in my mind. As the last survivors of Borealis, were we truly escaping? Or were we just carrying the seeds of the infection out into the world?